everybody. Thanks for listening to the Campus Safety Voices podcast. My name is Amy Rock, and I am Campus Safety Senior Editor. For this episode, I spoke with psychologist Teodora Pavkovic about how to talk to students about school violence, particularly school shootings, and how to appropriately adjust those discussions based on a student's age. In addition to being a psychologist, Teodora is a parenting coach and digital wellness expert and is the director of community engagement for LineWise, which helps schools filter content, manage classrooms, and keep kids safe while using the internet. Teodora spoke with me about questions and concerns that arise among kids and teens following a violent incident at a school, tips for school employees on how to answer questions students might have about violence, advice for how parents can address the topic of school violence at home, and also free resources for speaking with kids about violence. Here's our discussion. Be sure to subscribe to Campus Safety's YouTube channel and like or leave a comment on our videos. Or subscribe to our Campus Safety Voices podcast on Apple and Spotify and leave a review. For this Campus Safety Voices podcast, we'll be discussing how to help students navigate through fears of school violence. And to speak on the subject, we have Teodora Pavkovic, who is a youth psychologist and director of community engagement at LineWise, which is a classroom management technology company. And Teodora, just to give some context for our readers on your knowledge around today's topic, can you just elaborate on your background and expertise just a little bit?
Sure, of course. Thanks, Amy. I want to thank you, first of all, for this invitation. I want to thank everybody who is watching and listening and reading to our interview as well. So as you said, my name is Teodora Pavkovic. My background is in psychology and parent coaching, and I'm a certified digital wellness educator as well. So over the past sort of six to 7 years, I've been very kind of deeply embedded into the digital wellness space, and really this issue of how the technology that's all around us, all around our children that we use and that our kids use at home, at school, how all of that impacts them. And so for the past just sort of a little over a year, I've taken that work to LineWise, as you mentioned, which is a global leader among K-12 digital safety providers, providing a whole host of resources and tools and products that really help schools and school districts around the world really address these issues of children being safe online. And so, as you mentioned, I'm the community engagement director at LineWise. So I'm really in charge of that whole aspect of digital wellness and our digital wellness community program, which really educates the staff, it educates the students, and educates the parents as well around a whole kind of host of different issues surrounding online safety and digital wellness.
Awesome. And you mentioned online safety, and obviously this call is a bit more about physical safety, but it's all intertwined, obviously. And as a youth psychologist, I imagine you know more than most, how kids are really feeling about recent school violence tragedies. And what are the main struggles you're seeing kids and teens face regarding this?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's two things that I think we all fundamentally need as human beings. These needs are really a lot more emphasized and highlighted with young kids. So with children in particular, that safety and stability are really the two most important things that they need. And so they thrive in environments where there's predictability, where there are boundaries, where they sort of know what's coming next. And so where incidents like this happen with these sort of levels of school violence, they completely shatter any kind of sense that children may have had of sort of knowing what is going to come up during the next period, what is going to come up, when I go home after school, what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after and the day after. So they might generally sort of struggle to make sense of not just the incident that happened, but sort of life in general. Any concept of life they may have had up until that point may really be shaken. They may be struggling with feelings of guilt. So a lot of children will struggle with survivor's guilt in particular. How come I was saved and my classmate wasn't? And then some, of course, of the most serious struggles that we might see with kids will be really serious sort of emotional, psychological, behavioral issues, clinical mental health issues like anxiety, things like depression, and then, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder as well, or PTSD for short.
And I think a lot of those things, everyone thinks of, obviously school shootings are terrible, but they're still really rare. But these are feelings and emotions, I think, that you're describing that can kind of be applied to even less serious, for lack of a better term, incidents than school shootings. So I feel like it's valuable across the board.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really anything. I think the key idea really is that sense of routine and predictability that children really need in order to feel just that sense of safety. Really, safety, I would say, is the absolute key word in this whole conversation. And so anytime any type of school violence happens, like you said, it doesn't have to be that's this severe. That is really the main thing that is shaken for them. And like I said, they may start to sort of expand their fears into other areas, things that don't really seem particularly sort of rational or realistic. And I know it's something we'll get into as well, but with younger children in particular, this fear might sort of seep into other areas, and then they may not be feeling safe at home anymore. So they might start having fears around, what if someone breaks into the home? What if somebody hurts me in my home? What if somebody hurts my siblings and my parents? And so the fear, I mean, fear is often rational. Oftentimes it's not quite so rational, but when it happens to young children in particular, it's a really big emotion, and even as adults we struggle to really fully understand it and understand how to kind of soothe ourselves in the aftermath. So that's some of the common features that we'll see with kids regardless of their age, is that really intense fear, the whole concept of life being shaken, and what it means to have a safe home or a safe school, and then just that seeping out of the fear into sort of other aspects of their life.
And what are common questions kids from various age groups seem to ask, once something like a school shooting happens?
Yeah. Well, if it happens in sort of their own school or their own community, and they happen to make it through, they happen to survive. Some of the most fundamental questions that they will be asking, first of all, is will there be a next time? So will this happen again? And then could I be the one who gets hurt next time? Or again, if they have siblings in the same school, it could be could they get hurt as well? As I mentioned before, younger kids in particular. You do notice this kind of seeping of the fear and of the anxiety into other areas. So they may start feeling less sort of safe at home. They might have worries about someone sort of breaking into their home or hurting their family, things like that. With older kids, sort of middle schoolers, high schoolers too, you'll definitely see that fear around, can this happen to us again? They'll also have questions around what are you as the adults doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And they'll also sort of ask questions around sort of safety behaviors. So if this does happen again, how do I sort of prepare for it? How do I make sure that I'm more ready than I was now? I don't think, children or adults, it doesn't matter when this happens. I don't think anybody feels fully prepared. In some cases, we see that even, security, law enforcement are never quite as prepared as they think they are, regardless of all the sort of the dry runs they might do in safety drills. So children, least of all, feel prepared for this. And with older kids in particular, we do see these questions come up in terms of sort of what can they do next time? How can they be safer? How can they prepare themselves a little bit better when this happens again? And for kids, who weren't in the school where the tragedy happens, kids who are sort of watching the news or hearing about it, of course, their first questions will be around, can this happen at our school as well? That school looks kind of similar to ours. Those kids kind of look like the kids I see every single day. Could someone come and do this at our school? And again, those questions around how can we make sure that doesn't happen? How can we protect ourselves and each other?
Now, we were talking about the various age groups. Where, and I know this differs, but where is the typical breakdown in ages when it comes to, different approaches for discussing school violence? And I'm sure not every child obviously falls within these breakdowns exactly, depending on, their emotional capacity and other things, but just as a general rule of thumb.
Of course. Yeah, well, that's, I appreciate you saying that. I was going to mention that. I think keeping in mind those sort of typical developmental stages and the way children sort of emotionally, psychologically, physically progress through them is really important. But like you said, it is also important to keep in mind that each child will be different, and each sort of parent knows their child the best, first and foremost, but then the teachers who spend sometimes even more time with these kids than their parents do will also know best in terms of sort of maturity levels. So the recommendations coming from fields like psychiatry, like pediatrics as well, some of these recommendations give us a sort of general sense of when to talk to kids about it and when not to, and sort of how to do it. So typically the recommendation is that for any child who is younger than, let's say, again, keep it a little bit wider, so the sort of 8 to 10 age range, we really don't want to sort of initiate these conversations unless they've already heard them. If they've already heard them, of course, then we have to make sure that we do address them. But what we want to do with this age group is keep things very, very short, sort of very minimalistic, very simple, and very factual for kids who sort of fall within this group. And then for all kids below the age of about, say, 11 or 12, we really want to make sure that they stay away as much as possible from media, and especially very graphic media, whether those are videos, whether those are audio clips. It could be seeing things in news, it could be reading texts. The main reason being that even as adults, we really struggle to process violent imagery. It kind of sticks inside of your brain, and you can't get it out. And for younger kids in particular, this is a really big issue. They just don't have the capacity to work through imagery like that. So then when we sort of look beyond that age range into sort of younger teenagers or tweens, as we refer to them, so sort of between, let's say, the ages of about 11 to 14, oftentimes, their own psychological sort of developmental level and maturity will need to guide us with that. What we often want to know is, what do they know already? So a lot of it will depend on that. What have they heard of already? What are some of the questions that they have? And what do we sense they need most from us? Do they just want us to sit with them and be quiet? Do they want us to give them a lot of reassurance in terms of, we're safe as a family? Do they need reassurance around the school is a really safe place? Do they feel like they need to speak to a principal or a superintendent or, whatever it is? And this is true with sort of the older teenagers as well. So sort of 15 to 16. With them, you can certainly have much more sort of elaborate, wide, more detailed conversations. A lot of them, again, will be led by what they've heard of already. So where their sort of awareness level is at. And then also letting, again, sort of their safety needs guide you in the information that you're sharing with them. So again, they might just want to be held and hugged. If they're older teenagers, that's unlikely to be the case, but they might need that as well. They may be asking you a lot of questions around the person who committed the crime. So with older teens, this could happen in particular. Why did they do it? Where did this come from? What were they thinking? What were they feeling? Why did they act in this kind of a way? Again, it's all about that loss of any sense of control and of understanding of the world, and they need to make some kind of sense of it. So the varying factor really is how much of a sense of control and agency do children feel. And obviously, the younger they are, the less of that they feel, which means that we need to lean in a little bit heavier with the younger kids in order to really provide them that sense of safety, that sense of control, that sense of security. Older kids will need that as well, but you can really have a much more, like I said, detailed and elaborate conversation with them. And they're definitely going to ask you some more sort of pointed, in-depth questions. They might be very angry. They might want to know, how did this even happen? Who allowed this to happen? So I think for parents of older kids in particular, it might be good to prepare a little bit, but I think for educators as well, just to be prepared in terms of how you could possibly handle and navigate and answer some of those more complicated questions that you may not have the answer to, by the way. And it's also okay to admit that as well.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And do you think it's important? And like we had said, I think it depends on the child's capacity too, and what they can take on and handle. Do you think it's important that kids and teens in particular probably have a grasp on current events, even if that can cause anxiety?
I think it is. I think it's probably a lot more important for sort of older children, I would say teenagers, sort of older middle school into high school, for them to have an awareness of that. I think for younger kids, unless, again, the parents think there would be really a huge benefit in knowing that information, I don't think it's necessary to share it with them. A lot of the times, parents may not have much of a choice. So for example, say people of Ukrainian origin who live outside of Ukraine right now, they probably don't have a whole lot of choice around generally their families consuming news, right? It's going to be something that's constantly going to be on their minds, and they may feel very strongly about their children knowing exactly what is going on over there. That is a little bit of an outlier, obviously, a little bit of an exception. I would say, generally speaking, for older children, it is quite good for them to just to have an awareness of that, to be educated around that. I think it's really a kind of important part of their academic development, to understand what is going on in the world, and sort of how things work, or more often don't work. But I think one really important thing is for parents and educators to just be very mindful of where children are getting their information from. So we know from a lot of the polls and the research that's been done over the past sort of 5 or so years, that young people tend to get most of their news not from traditional sources like some of us, let's call us older people, but they tend to mostly get it from social media, and they'll get it from, influencers. So you're talking about sort of information that is once or twice or thrice removed. So I think, wherever they're getting their news from, I think the adults in their lives need to just be aware of where that is coming from. And I always really encourage parents to have even daily conversations with their kids around, what have you heard, and did you come across any news that was really troubling, that was confusing? Were there things that didn't make sense? Just sort of use that as a conversation point. I think the worst thing that can happen, even with older kids, is that they consume very complex, very, very difficult, very horrifying news all by themselves, sort of in their room while they're on Snapchat or YouTube or TikTok or whatever it is that they're using. I think it's very important that we sort of bring them out of that solitude, and we make sure that they can verbalize all of these things that they're taking in, because even if they're sort of 16, 17, 18 years old and they're practically young adults, they could still use a little bit of our help and a little bit of our assistance, if for no other reason, just to sort of externalize these feelings that might have of the sort of craziness that we often see in the world, both locally and sort of internationally as well.
It's so difficult because even as an adult, you had brought up the war in Ukraine. You can't even wrap your head around that level of evil, And so it's like you said, even if it's not trying to understand, it's like sharing your feelings as well, that, I feel this way too, but like, we'll get through it together. We'll talk through everything. And
exactly. Yeah. And I think it's always good also to, this is where a little bit of that, it's not necessarily a silver lining, but I think some kind of hope that can permeate all of these stories. And part of my background's in positive psychology, which is why I'm always seeking out those sort of learning moments and the lessons in resilience in particular that we can build for kids, and make sure that they're still at least somewhat oriented towards sort of positivity and, like I said, endurance and resilience and grittiness. They probably, most of them would have learned about the Second World War and even other conflicts that, go back to sort of the ancient world. There were kids around those times as well who were also struggling in all sorts of ways when that was happening. For a lot of us, that would have been our grandparents or our grandparents who went through that. I think it's important to also, while we're holding space for these horrible things that are happening, to also acknowledge that we have gotten through all of the other ones that have already happened. Unfortunately, there have been so many in this world. And there are ways in which people can still find ways to kind of make more sense of things and have more agency and have more control. And even if it's within their own sort of little tiny community, there's still certain things that they can do that can give them a little bit more meaning and a little bit more hope, and that can really create a little bit more positivity sort of on a daily basis, even if in sort of very small doses.
And while I'm sure there's definitely some crossover, I kind of want to break down my next questions into advice for teachers and school staff, and then advice for parents. So for school employees, what are some suggested points to emphasize when talking to children about violence? And can you kind of break that down by age group as well?
Sure. So I think there's definitely some sort of general points that are going to be relevant for each age group. So I'll mention those, because I think the only thing really that varies with that is sort of the complexity of the language that we use. And as I said before, with younger kids, we really don't need to burden them with details around sort of exactly what happened. We want to keep it very, very short and sort of very to the point. But some of the sort of general themes that we want to make sure we get across with each age group in a developmentally appropriate way, of course. Number one is safety. Again, as I said, I think safety is key in this whole conversation. So we want to emphasize what are the safety measures that are in place, that exist right now. We want the kids to know exactly how these safety measures are sort of being implemented and how this makes school a safer place for them. And if we need to, we want to remind them of that on a regular basis. The other thing that we want to remind them of, and it touches upon what we just talked about when we talked about your previous question, is we also want to highlight all of the things sort of that were done right in response to what had happened. So we want to talk about the interventions that actually work. We want to talk about any of the sort of the positivity and the support and the care and the help that emerged within the community in the aftermath, so that they really feel that there is that sort of positive energy around there, that there are people who are trying to make the very best out of it that they possibly can. And we want to make sure we remind them of this sort of on a regular basis. You mentioned this at the beginning of our interview. I think it is important to also take it into that onto that very rational level and talk about numbers and remind them of the fact that as horrific and tragic as these events are, luckily they are still very, very rare. They shouldn't exist at all, and we all know this, but they are still very, very rare because, like I said earlier, fear with adults as well, especially with kids, can really expand and it can reach some pretty irrational levels into sort of catastrophizing. So we need to kind of bring that back into sort of reality and make sure that kids are aware of just how rare these events actually are. And then also we always want to end on that practical note in terms of, okay, what are we doing now and what can we do in terms of sort of preventative measures? And this can go into conversations around, so for example, what do we do when we notice that someone is being bullied? Or what do we do when we notice that a classmate is struggling in any way? Or if we notice that their behavior is a little bit different, or they're maybe talking about things that they don't normally talk about. It could be very violent things, very graphic things. Maybe their behavior has become a lot more sort of violent or aggressive. And what do we do if we hear or see something that really worries us, either when it comes to our own safety or somebody else's as well? So really communicating to kids that there are little and big things that the school is doing on a daily basis to ensure that this is taken care of, but then also remind them of the things that they can do as well. And this applies to them if they're 6 and if they're 16. There's different things that all of these different age groups can do, but those would sort of be some of the main themes that I think are very important to touch upon.
And now I'm sure this could be so many opinions on this as well, but do you think it's something that should be discussed at a higher level, like from principals or superintendents, or should it be something that's addressed, as students bring up questions in the classroom and on a case by case basis?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it will depend. So there are a lot of sort of factors there that will determine that. I think obviously the bigger the district and the more schools that are housed within that district, the more likely it is that this information has seeped through. So even if you don't expect that your kindergartners would have heard about that, it's highly unlikely that your high schoolers didn't, right? Because they're already probably consuming news on a daily basis. I think it will depend, of course, on the size of the schools and the districts and the resources and things of that kind. I think that the best is probably a sort of combination, a combined approach. So I do think for that, again, sense of safety and security and having that feeling of, okay, we know who's in charge and who's doing what to make the situation better or prevent bad things from happening. I think it's very important for the senior leadership to be very vocal and be very visible. When it comes to the younger students, this will obviously matter a lot more to their parents. So they'll want to make sure that they know what the school is doing to keep their 5 or 6 or 7-year-olds safe. I think when you're looking at older kids, this will matter to them a lot as well. So I think the high schoolers, because they will have a lot of those feelings of anger and, how could you let this happen? They'll really want to know what is actually being done to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But I also think that other staff members, such as counselors and student safety officers and the social workers and the nurses and really anybody who does that kind of work with the students and with their parents, that they're also there in order to talk to kids on that case by case basis. If one child comes up to them or a small group of them come up and they have questions or they're struggling or they have issues with anything. So I think that kind of approach that combines both senior leadership and deals with things and addresses them on a case by case basis, I think that combination is really the best.
Yeah, it's kind of important to have everyone like on the same page to the response, because
Exactly.
every kid's fine. There's a kid who might find a connection with the janitor or someone who's close with the nurse.
Absolutely.
They're going to go to whoever they're the most comfortable with asking these. It's
Absolutely.
not going to necessarily be their classroom teacher. And so
Exactly.
going off of that, what kinds of
Yeah.
resources are available for schools looking to implement teacher trainings on, how to handle speaking about these situations?
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing because luckily there are a few really great resources. The sad thing, of course, is that they even have to exist, and the reasons behind why they do. So a few of the ones that are really kind of prominent within the U.S. are ones like Sandy Hook Promise, I Love You Guys, and Protecting Our Students as well. I think that one is protectingoursstudents.org. So these are some of the nonprofits that really any school or district. Again, I know resourcing is always a very, very big issue, and it's a very big question in terms of how much time can we actually dedicate to sort of training our staff, educating our staff, being prepared to address these types of situations and these types of conversations too. But these three are some of the really good resources. A lot of them have some free resources that really any educator, any senior leadership team member can also tap into and pull from there in order to address these types of conversations within their community.
Now, parents can't control how schools handle addressing it, and they also
Yeah.
can't control, like we're saying, what their kids hear from other kids about it. So what are some basic tips you have for parents in how they can discuss the issue at home, and again, break that down by age as well, if you don't mind?
Sure. Yeah. So again, like I said, unless they've heard something, there's no need to bring it up. If you do think that they've heard something, so you either know that they have because they've brought it up to you, or you've kind of overheard them talking to somebody else about it. For younger kids as well, if you see them playing it out, sort of with their toys, or if they're gamers, and you notice that they're starting to play out some of these types of games where either they're pretending to be the sort of the shooter, if that's what the situation was about, or being the victim. All of that is normal, developmentally absolutely appropriate. It's their way of trying to work through it and make sense of it. But that will definitely let you know that they do know about it, they have some level of awareness, and you want to talk to them about it. So again, for that slightly sort of younger age group, you want to keep it very, very simple. Again, you don't need to give too many details. You want to lean more heavily, again, into some of those safety aspects of the intervention itself. You want to focus a little bit on that, and then you want to end on that sort of positive note in terms of sort of what is happening moving forward. So, for example, you could say something like, somebody got really angry and hurt other people. If you want to, you can add other details there, things like because they didn't know how to manage their feelings, or because they were very upset that day, or they behaved in a way in which we've talked about before, and we never act in ways like that with other kids. This will depend on the parents themselves and sort of the values they want to get across to their kids. The second aspect is those sort of interventions. So what was it done, or what was done about it? So the school staff, security, police, firefighters, whoever it was, they stepped in to make sure to stop this person, to make sure that the rest of the school was safe. And then the final bit is, from now on, the police or your teachers or your coaches, or whoever it is, will make sure to do A, B, and C to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So keeping it very, very simple, and then also leaving some room there for them to then sort of process it in their own minds, and then they might likely have some questions for you. If they don't have any at that moment, you don't need to pry and poke and try to get those questions out of them. Just let them know that I know this is scary. It was really scary for me too. You don't have to ask me anything right now or say anything right now, but I'm here. If you need to ask me something, please do that, or ask your favorite teacher, whoever it is in school that the child's comfortable with. When you're talking about the older kids, then, so you're talking sort of the tweens and the high schoolers, as I mentioned before, you want to begin with what they've heard already. So ask them, what's the information that you have already, and sort of what are your thoughts on it? What are some of the first thoughts that emerged for you, and what are some of the sort of the main emotions that came up for you? And then from there, the child's own, again, maturity level, developmental level will sort of determine how much detail you give, and how much you want to talk about, for example, the reasons why the shooter did what they did. So maybe you'll want to bring up mental health issues. We know that in pretty much 100% of these cases, there are always very serious mental health issues happening, and that have been happening for a while, and that there were traces of for a good amount of time. We definitely saw that at Oxford, that there were these little sort of crumbs that the shooter was leaving everywhere. So you might want to talk about mental health issues, and about when we feel sad, or when we feel upset, or when we feel angry, or when we feel so frustrated that we want to hurt somebody else. What do we do about things like that? You will definitely want to talk about those safety measures that are being put into place. Again, it's really always important to bring that back in. Again, the fact that school shootings are very, very rare. They're horrible and they're tragic, but they are actually very rare. And then again, any way that you're able to do that, to bring in some of that good that inevitably and luckily always comes out in the aftermath of these tragic events. I think that's probably the only thing that really keeps us sane in the aftermath, is that the community really comes in together. So many wonderful things emerge. You'll also, with older kids in particular, really want to talk to them about keeping or continuing to keep up any kind of regular routines that they already have. There is often that tendency to, when something like that happens, because you feel like your sense of sort of control and like I said, sense making and peace of mind and everything just sort of explodes and is shattered, there is often that tendency to try and stay in bed a lot longer. So try to sleep longer, eat more or eat less, stay up later, whatever it is, some kind of break in the routine. It's really important to, with younger kids, just to enforce those, because you don't need to do too much explaining around them. But when they're older, to definitely talk to them about how important it is to keep that routine, because it's one of the most important coping mechanisms that we have. It brings us back that sense of control. So you can talk to your tween or your teenager around what are some of the things that you can do on a regular basis. It can be go for a walk. It can be go and game for 30 minutes. It can be go take the dog out for a walk. It can be listen to music. It can be do some physical activity, play a sport, talk to your best friend. It doesn't matter, whatever it is, but something that can keep them grounded and that can really sort of keep them centered and help them sort of cope. Those coping mechanisms are incredibly important in the aftermath of anything that happens. So that's sort of a breakdown, sort of depending on the child's age.
And earlier you spoke about how anxiety or fear can kind of carry over to not feeling safe at home. And so I'd imagine it's good. Is it good to also emphasize safety at home and things we do, to keep them safe at home, and hope that translates to a school setting as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And once, like I said before, once that anxiety and that fear hits, it can be very overwhelming for the child, and it can really become quite generalized. And when we often talk about anxiety, I think in an increasingly sort of casual way, but I think it's important to remember that the actual diagnosis is called generalized anxiety disorder, because that's one of the sort of the features of anxiety, is it can be triggered by something very specific, but then it sort of seeps into sort of everything else. And so for younger children in particular, who are still not sort of emotionally, definitely not cognitively well developed enough yet to be able to make sense of their emotions, to regulate their emotions, to just make better sense of the world around them. We really need to help them when those states of sort of anxiety kick in. And some of the most important things that we really need to do is to really normalize whatever they're feeling, and to help them verbalize it. Oftentimes it's very hard for them to talk about it. When young people experience something like this, and I think most of the people who will be listening to this and watching would have in some shape or form experienced September 11th, if not very directly, they would have heard about it. And I'm sure we all remember with events like that, unfortunately there's been others in the world, how that really fundamentally shifts how you think about life and safety and just the kind of the meaning of life and the meaning of things. And for younger children, especially if the shooting happens in their own school, it may take them a very long time to actually verbalize those fears, because they may feel like the world is ending. So it's incredibly important to normalize those feelings, to really be very patient with them, give them a little bit of time to start to actually talk about sort of what's going on, never to kind of negate or lessen those feelings for them, never to make them feel like they're not that important, or they're not that big of a deal. It's okay, it will just pass. We don't want to fall into that sort of aspect of positivity, where it's just becoming toxic and it's really negating all the legitimate heavy negative feelings that are happening. The message of hope, of course, as I've said before, is the fact that humans have this huge capacity to be resilient. and to be gritty, and to do it even or especially when we're facing really, really difficult circumstances. So to really try to remind kids of that and of the fact that we have a huge capacity to hold all sorts of different emotions. And sometimes we can hold more than one emotion at the same time, and they can be contradictory emotions. So reminding kids of things like, you may be feeling anxious right now and you're very nervous right now. But for example, when you come home and you're sitting in your bedroom, you may also be feeling a sense of safety in that moment because that space for you means safety. Or if it's a child who loves outdoor sports, for example, you can still feel very sad and very angry about what happened in school and the school shooting. But when you go out hiking, for example, you feel that sense of peace and you feel a sense of groundness. So it's important as part of teaching them how to emotionally regulate to help them understand that it's totally normal that they're battling with all these sort of different emotions at the very same time. And I think ultimately it's really important to help them feel comfortable with asking for professional help if they need it. We talk about that stigma surrounding mental health all the time. We've done a lot of work to help reduce it. It's still there, obviously, and within certain communities more than others. But it's really important to remind them that if things don't feel great right now, if you've already been struggling for a little bit, there's no need to struggle anymore. Now is the time. Yesterday is when we should have done this, but let's do it now so that moving forward you can get some additional tools and get some additional help with this. I think building out that sort of almost like a first aid kit when it comes to mental health and helping kids develop that toolbox that they can use in really any instance in the future. It doesn't have to be something quite as severe as this, but just helping them build up some of those actions and activities and practices that they can do that will help sort of calm them and soothe them and center them and ground them while they're still feeling very worried. Again, those things can happen at the same time, but the more they become accustomed to regulating their emotions, practicing some of these calming and soothing behaviors, actively seeking out help, the better prepared they're going to be really for any kind of challenge that they face in life.
I think the increase in parents discussing emotions with kids is really hopefully going to change the trajectory of a lot of things. Hopefully someone who feels the urge to be violent, it will rethink it because they have parents who are open to speaking with them about things. And you think of generations before us, especially, you'd hear like old Italian families, like no one spoke about emotions, and now I follow 10 Instagram accounts about how to help my toddler through their emotions. I just think there's so many more resources and easily accessible ways to find out how to speak to your kids about how they're feeling just on a day-to-day basis, never mind when there's something so tragic or sad about a school shooting.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Emotions are around us all the time, and they're inside of us and they're between us and they're around us really on a daily basis from 1 minute to the next. I had the wonderful opportunity to deliver a TEDx talk on this very topic and how we talk to children about their emotions and the fact that we really start communicating to them what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable in terms of their emotions from a very early age, well before they're even verbal. And we do that through how we behave, through how we sort of respond anytime that they show an emotion. So, you gave that example of sort of older Italian families and what the culture was like within those families. There's certainly lots of other cultures where that was the case. I would argue most cultures have been like that for a very, very long time. And so, in those types of instances, you might notice that, if a little toddler, so your child's age starts to cry, the adults might not even say anything to them, but they'll give them a certain look, a certain stern look that will send that message of, you don't get to do that. That is not acceptable. You don't get to cry when you're sad or hungry or angry or whatever it is, right? So I always say it's a very difficult, challenging job for parents to do this. I think it's important that as we encourage parents to talk about these things, we also help to educate parents about what emotions are and what they do and how we communicate with them to our kids, because oftentimes we send messages across without using any words. It's really in our faces, it's in our bodies. Sometimes it can even be the tone of our voice, not so much what we're actually saying to them. But I think it's, as you mentioned, I think it's a really good, really important trend to get young people more used to thinking about how they're feeling in certain situations. Think about what urge then they have, what behavioral urge they have as a result of that feeling. And then to consider, is that really the way I want to go? Is that really the way I want to show up right now or not? And again, with older kids, that can be a really useful conversational point when talking about school shootings, because there is that context to most of these events, not all of them, but in many of these cases, we have a young person who was really struggling mentally and emotionally. No one was there to ask questions around how they were feeling or why they were feeling. They were too young to really understand themselves. Again, as I mentioned before, they were leaving sort of breadcrumbs everywhere, but no one was really noticing them, or if they were, then they didn't quite know what to do with it. And so you were left with a person who had all of these pent up emotions and thoughts that they didn't understand, they didn't know what to do with them, and how they ended up showing up and how that emerged in that behavioral sense is that they took a gun and they killed other children. And of course, that is one of the absolute worst case scenarios, and we don't want to talk to younger kids about that. But I think with older teenagers, young adults, we can certainly use that as an example of how those emotions and thoughts and behaviors all connect up, and how we can go about making more sense of them and thinking about how we want to help people much, much earlier at that stage.